resolved that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The resolution had passed. They sat in silence. Some began to weep. The following day, John Adams wrote to his beloved Abigail, "Yesterday the greatest question was decided, which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was or will be decided among men. You will see in a few days a declaration setting forth the causes which have impelled us to this mighty revolution, and the reasons which will justify it in the sight of God and man. The people will have unbounded power, and the people are extremely addicted to corruption and venality, as well as the great. I am not without apprehension from this quarter, but I must submit all my hopes and fears to an overruling providence, in which, unfashionable as the faith may be, I firmly believe. But the day is past. The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America." Close.
Yes.
I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the Day of Deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. Is that how you celebrated this past summer? It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. He was close. We do it on the 4th instead of the 2nd, but the 2nd was the day when they cast the vote. And for them, that was the day we declared our independence. But here's what he says about this. "You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, we could possibly ruin it, which I trust in God we shall not." The task of winning the most formidable war against one of the greatest militaries the world had ever seen, so many would bear that burden. Countless would give their time, their possessions, their money, their resources, incalculable sacrifices, including their own lives from time to time. But the fate of the new nation seemed to be thrust, if upon one person in particular, one to whom the whole nation looked, aside from the Lord God himself, placed all their hopes in. George Washington was born February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He had 4 older half-siblings from his father, Augustine, and his first wife, Jane. However, the oldest boy, Butler, died in infancy, and the youngest child, Jane, died when she was age 12. So that left Lawrence and Augustine to survive from the first marriage and live on into adulthood. Augustine Sr. then married Mary Ball in 1731 after his first wife's death, which then George was born the following year, so he was the oldest of that marriage. They would also go on to have Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, Charles, and Mildred, though Mildred would die before the age of 1. On April 12, 1743, though, when George was only 11 years old as my oldest son, Justus, his father, Augustine, died from a sudden illness. The land was divided up amongst the boys. Mary, George's mom, would help him run his share, Ferry Farm, is what he inherited. Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek, which he would rename Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, whom he had served under in the British Navy. George very much looked to his older brothers, greatly cherished them, especially Lawrence. He was a surrogate father to him, a very influential role model. And in 1749, Lawrence sailed to England to seek medical advice because he had contracted tuberculosis. He also would frequent the warm baths of the springs of Bath, Virginia, which is now called Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. But his health was not improving, so in September of 1751, he planned to go on a trip to the Caribbean. Why not? So he ventured to Barbados, and George said, ooh, can I come with you? Maybe not quite like that, but he wanted to go very desperately. Age 19, right? Who wants to sail the ocean and go see the Caribbean? Age 19, and his brother said, absolutely, you can come along. And so they were hoping the warm climate would do Lawrence some good and make him feel a little bit better. George, though, actually on the trip contracts smallpox. He is a young, strapping, healthy young man, though, and is able to get over it with not much difficulty. It will leave his face slightly scarred, but he recovers and is therefore immune the entire rest of his life. Now, isn't that fascinating? When one considers, then, what was the number one cause of death amongst soldiers fighting in the Revolutionary War? It was not wounds from battle. It was what? Smallpox. Yet the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army was immune to it all and could be in those camps with those soldiers and it not affect him. Just happened to be immune from the number one cause of death. George recovered and decided that it was time for him to sail home, as Lawrence is going to go on down to the Bermudas. And the trip back home was one that the whole trip was greatly influential in Washington's life, as through the travels he got to dine with some of the best families, learn from many of the military officers he got to visit with, see and understand how British fortifications operated. Very informative trip for this young man, but also inspired him to want to pursue a military career, which he does. His brother finally returns home to Mount Vernon a few months later, where he, in January of 1752, succumbs to the tuberculosis. And so now George has lost both of his older brothers, and has lost Lawrence and his father. Lawrence's widow, Anne, will die in 1761, and they had all four of their children die in infancy or childhood. So this left only George then to inherit the property, and thus he became the owner of the Mount Vernon estate. After his brother's death, George enlisted in the Virginia militia due to his experience as a surveyor. Governor Dinwiddie, if you recall from our first week of lessons, appointed him as a major in February of 1753. In December of that year is when George goes and meets with the French General Saint-Pierre to ask him about, on behalf of Governor Dinwiddie, to remove the French forces from Virginia territory because they didn't like them being there, to which the French general said it knew. And so they departed, and then we eventually had the events of Fort Necessity and Fort Duquesne. As you recall, the protective shield around George Washington, the 4 bullet holes through his coat, and he had no wounds at all. In fact, did he ever receive any wound in any battle ever? No, even though he was usually the tallest, biggest target on a white horse. Remarkable. After the Forbes expedition, in which Fort Duquesne is finally captured, and as you recall, this whole meeting with George Washington sent the whole world spiraling into the 7 Years' War, just because George had dinner with a Frenchman. I mean, that's you know. But anyway, December 1758, Fort Duquesne is captured. He's like, wonderful, I'm going to go home. I'm going to resign, retire, and be done with my military career. Part of the inspiration for his urgency to want to get home that December was because the very next month, as a part of the conclusion to the Christmas festivities, he was getting married. He had met a lovely young lady named Martha Custis, who was 28 years old. Her first husband, Daniel, had died at the age of 45. George is 26, so he's marrying an older lady at that point. I mean, it was like, George, what are you thinking? She's an old... Yeah, they know. Anyway, I'm just telling you, the culture then, okay? So, but he's going to turn 27 the next, in February after they get married. But anyway, George and Martha are married on Saturday, January 6, 1759, and from then on, their anniversary is forever part of the Christmas tradition, the festivities of Christmas. Because back then, if you celebrated Christmas, you very much did the 12 days of Christmas, which began back at Christmas and would go all the way into January. And so their anniversary would be the final day after the 12 days of Christmas, thus the conclusion to the Christmas festivities. That's a pretty fun way to celebrate for them. However, in Christmas of 1773, feelings around the house may have been a little different that holiday season. For one, just 9 days earlier, on December 16th, the Sons of Liberty had had a tea party. And now, as you recall from last night, you realize the severity of that event. There's a lot of tension and wonder, maybe some anxiety in the colonies as to what the king is going to do about that. If you weren't here, that one event, one night, single-handedly bankrupted the largest company in the entire British Empire. Not good for the economy and for a king who's trying to rebuild the treasury. Personally, for the Washingtons, Martha's youngest child, Patsy, she and George were never able to have any children. So George raised Martha's two surviving children from her previous marriage. Well, Patsy this year, she was 17 years old, and she was having difficulties with the seizures that she had been experiencing since she was about 11 or 12 years old. They had grown in frequency and severity, and on June 19th of that year, she went up to her room about 4 o'clock to retrieve a letter from her older brother, John, because he was away to college and his fiancée, Eleanor, was visiting. And she's like, oh, I have a letter from John. Let me go up and get it so I can read it to you. Well, they heard some commotion upstairs and rushed up to see what was happening, and she was laying there on the floor having a severe seizure. George picked her up, placed her on the bed, knelt beside her, and began to pray. He had raised her since she was 3 years old, so she was his daughter. But within 2 minutes, she had passed away. That's what was going on in George and Martha's life during all those events I told you about last night. He wrote the next day to his brother-in-law, Burwell Bassett, that was Martha's sister, Anna, her husband, and said this, quote, "It is an easier matter to conceive than to describe the distress of this family, especially that of the unhappy parent of our dear Patsy Custis, when I inform you that yesterday removed the sweet, innocent girl into a more happy and peaceful abode than any she has met with in the afflicted path she hitherto has trod." Where did George know his daughter was? And what was the comfort that George and Martha had regarding their daughter's death? That just as David said when his child died, child can't come to me, but one day I can go to the child. George canceled all of his events, all of his affairs for the next 3 months so he could be home with Martha as they grieved, yet celebrated Patsy's victory. On March 23rd, 1775, George attended the Second Virginia Convention at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, which was addressing the matter of whether Virginia should send any of its militia to the relief of Boston, as you recall from last night. They did not meet in the capital in Williamsburg because, since the Intolerable Acts had been passed, the Coercive Acts, that's the official name, there were British soldiers everywhere listening in on things, especially state affairs in the capitals. So they went to the church. And there they discussed whether they should send them. And most of them said, no, we don't need to get involved in this and drag Virginia into all this problems and everything. And then this young orator stood up, and George Washington, sitting there with some other men like Edmund Randolph and Thomas Jefferson, they were all there to hear this, gives this incredible, moving, as some of them said, one of the greatest delivered speeches they ever heard in their life. The conclusion to which Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And the convention changed its mind and decided to send militia to the relief of Boston. The very next month saw the events of Lexington and Concord, and the colonies seemingly on the verge of war with their mother country. And on May 10th, George attended services at Christ Church in Philadelphia as one of the delegates selected to go on behalf of Virginia to the Second Continental Congress, but he didn't stay for long. Because on June 14th, George was selected as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, promoted to the rank of general to lead the freeing of Boston from British control. George wrote to his brother-in-law Burwell that he was now, quote, embarked on a tempestuous ocean from whence perhaps no friendly harbor is to be found. He said he accepted the responsibility, because remember, he was retired, enjoying life at home. But he accepted the responsibility on a firm belief in the, quote, justice of our cause. Though he was very worried about leaving Martha at home at Mount Vernon. In fact, from then on, it would be 6 years until he is able to go back home. Martha, though, frequently was at his side, even at great peril to her own life. She was there almost, as far as I know, every Christmas she was there. Didn't miss their anniversary. Would often cheer up the troops. She was the first unofficial head of the USO. She was to help them out. She really was. And they would brave 20 miles, if necessary, to attend assembly, service, worship on the Lord's Day. Well, Martha was always with them. And in 1781, after all these years of war, Martha's son John, who was called Jackie, he, along with his wife Eleanor, that was her name too, it's a common name, they gave birth to their 7th child. He was the 4th of 4 to actually live to adulthood. And they named him George Washington Parke Custis in honor of the leader of the country. And later that year, Jackie came and joined his mother and stepfather at the siege of Yorktown, where British forces had been backed up against the sea there in Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 1781. General Cornwallis realized he needed to retreat, but the French Navy was keeping any British ships from coming to the aid of Cornwallis. So Cornwallis decided that he too must now retreat. And he's like, hey, look, a river right behind where they were at. There's a river right there that comes out here to the Atlantic. And he's like, it worked for George. Why not for me? About about half of his troops had made it across the York River when Cornwallis recorded in a letter to to Sir Henry Clinton, quote, "At this critical moment, the weather, from being moderate and calm, changed to a violent storm of wind and rain and drove all the boats, some of which had troops on board, clear down the river. And so now half of his forces were completely separated from him, a great distance away, and he had half the troops he had started with now to face Washington and can't escape." Just another coincidence of weather during this war. Have you noticed many of them at this point? Well, in the midst of all this, Cornwallis officially surrenders on October 19th, 1781, effectively ending the successful war for independence. But during this, Jackie caught camp fever, is what it was called. So George, Martha, and Jackie celebrated the surrender, but didn't stay around too long because he wasn't getting any better. And they traveled about 30 miles to the northwest to Burwell and Anna's home. That's Martha's sister, as you recall. And he did not improve. And on November 5th, just half a month since the surrender of Cornwallis, Jackie passed away. And so now they've lost both of their children. George and Martha would invite Eleanor to come stay with them as they would help to try to raise the 4 surviving children. In November of 1783, George is at home, and very excitingly, a messenger comes and shares with him the news everybody had been waiting and hoping for, that the official peace treaty had been signed in France, with His Majesty's government officially recognizing the said United States of America. George immediately gets on his horse after telling everybody the exciting news and rides to Annapolis, where he famously surrenders his commission, resigns, and gets out of there and heads back home as fast as he can, to the shock of the world. King George was like, he did what? He hurried home to be with his family for Christmas. And along the way, he stopped and did some shopping. It included a locket, 3 small pocketbooks, 3 thimbles, 3 sashes, a dress cap, a hat, a whirligig, one of those things you pull and it makes it spin, a fiddle, that was pretty nice, a gun, not sure if that was for him or somebody else, and quadrille boxes for everybody. Those were very nice, tailor-made wooden boxes to hold playing cards in, to give as presents. And the world is going, what are you doing? Never in the history of the world had the victorious, conquering leader of the military, after winning the Great War, goes, okay, that's great, I'm going home. No, what have they always done? They became king or emperor. And George, instead of sitting down on the throne to reign over the United States, is going, okay, I'll take this and that, because, oh no, they won't like that. Oh, that'll be great for Christmas. Everybody will be surprised. And that's what he's doing. This is what is meant by American exceptionalism. It's not that the people of America are a superior people to everyone else in the world. No, not at all. It's that our founding and how we started and what these people did was the exception to the rules of world history. No one had ever done what we had done before. We're the exception. And that's what's exceptional about it. It's incredible. It just mind-blowing to the rest of the world. I can't overemphasize. That's why that painting of Washington giving his papers of resignation to the Congress is one of those 8 paintings in the rotunda of the Capitol, because that's when everything we knew had changed. And we're not going back to the old ways of a monarchy ruling over us. There's a reason why this man had to be the man who was the leader of the country. And he gets home, enjoys his retirement, and a wonderful Christmas, an exciting, just great Christmas. And in May of the following year, 1787,